I want to give you a simple sort of heuristic that you can use. Now, this won't always work, but it's a good heuristic to help you identify when you're moving into an area where you're more likely to get something dreamed up by the large language model. Something dreamed up by GPT-4 that might be a hallucination. Now, we might want hallucinations, we might not want hallucinations, and I'm going to try to show you what I mean by this. But I want to start off by just kind of give you a rough sense of how do you know if you've moved into a space where it's more likely that you will have it create new ideas as opposed to build new ideas that are based on input that you provided it. So, a really simple heuristic to look at is how much information are you giving it in the prompt versus how much information is it generating for you. So here's an example where I really want it to hallucinate, to dream things up for me. And I'm basically telling it, generate a sample receipt from a rental car company that includes all of the various forms of insurance. And then down beneath here, it goes through and generates all kinds of information. Now look how much more text it's generated than the information I gave it. I gave it a very small amount of information. I just told it generate a receipt. I didn't tell it what should go in it. I just said it was a rental car receipt. And I said it had to have various forms of information, but I didn't specify exactly what. That's not a lot of information in my prompt. But what it's giving us is a whole lot more information. So if you look at the amount of information in your prompt relative to how much information it's producing, if it's producing a lot more information than is in your prompt, that means it's having to fill in the gap somewhere. And typically where it's going to be filling in that gap is by either relying on something that was in its training data or trying to generate new data that looks like the pattern that you're kind of describing to it. So anytime you move into this space, you're more likely to get some output that could have an error in it. You're more likely to see errors in this scenario where you have a very small amount of information going into your prompt. You're defining what you want, but you're not giving a ton of information about what you want. It's just like one sentence, and we're getting a lot of information out. So anytime we're moving from a small amount and we're basically going to a larger amount of information, something has to fill in that information, and that's going to be the large language model. And depending on how you view what it's doing, you could either consider it hallucination and an error, or you could just consider it generating good content. Now, in this case, I wanted it to generate a fake receipt for me. This is, by the way, a really powerful way of using a tool. If you're in an organization where you can't go and put in your private data, but you would love to experiment, well, one way to do it is go and generate fake data. Use Code Interpreter to generate fake data that is close enough but not going to expose private details or be a problem for you to use. So go generate fake data to your heart's content. As you can see right here, it generates a rental card receipt for us that's really effective. But in this case, I want it to hallucinate, come up with different ideas. And now I'm not even going to call this hallucination. I think this is just generating valid, good data for me. It's generating valid synthetic data for me to use. I don't think of this as hallucination. Some people say this is still hallucination, but I'm going to use hallucination a little bit differently. I'm going to say hallucinations, typically I'm going to think of it in terms of a bad form, something we don't want. But anytime we go from a small amount of information to a much larger amount of information, something has to fill the gap. And that's where we're more likely to get errors. Now, let's contrast that with doing something different. This is a really small prompt. Manually identify key points and themes in this transcript. But the difference is I'm providing it a document, and that document's a really big document. So what it's going to do is it's going to look at the overall document or some piece of it plus my prompt. So it's actually getting a lot of information, and then it's going and producing the key points and themes down here. Now, the important point of this is it's actually going from a larger amount of information down to a smaller amount of information. I'm trying to have it essentially summarized by providing key points and themes. So in this case, where I'm giving it a document and I'm giving it a very small prompt, I'm much less likely to end up in the case where it's generating errors because I'm giving it a lot to work with and I'm asking it to go from a lot of information down to a smaller amount of information. Now, it can still make mistakes, but generally the place where you're going to be more out on the edge is when you're going from a smaller amount to a larger amount. In this case, I've got a much larger amount and I'm going to a smaller amount. It's not having to fill in new details. It's trying to do a good job of identifying and getting key points and themes. That's a different thing. That's generally trying to shrink down the amount of information, make it more focused and concrete. Now, it could get it wrong. It could still make mistakes. But if you're looking at these two cases, small amount of information up to large amount of information, that's where you're more likely probably to see mistakes than you are if you go from a large of information down to a small amount of information. Now, mistakes are always possible. No matter what, you want to fact check. You want to look at what's being done. You want to make sure that you take ownership of it because you are the author of whatever you take out of this and use. It is not the author. You are personally responsible for the content. But you should be extremely careful when you go from small to large. In particular, you should put extra scrutiny. If whatever baseline level of scrutiny you put on all the content, you should think very carefully in those cases where you go from small to large to be very careful in those cases as well. Now, it can become difficult sometimes to see the difference. If you have a long conversation and this is in the middle of it, it may actually have a large amount of information to work with, or it may go and read something. Now, another thing you can use to help figure out is that pulling in some extra information is, I've got a short prompt here, but I don't have any gray box that tells me that it's writing Python code. If I had seen a gray box here at the beginning, at the top of this, it would tell me it's writing Python code to do something. And not only then am I going to be using the prompt, but I'm going to be using the output of that Python code in many cases. In this case, what we see is when I say manually identify key points, we then see gray boxes where it's writing Python code. In this result down here, that long bit of text that I'm highlighting, that's going to end up being part of the input. And then we see it doing it again down here and getting more stuff from the input. And so it's building up and actually taking in a lot of different inputs to it. So if we don't see a gray box either, that also indicates to us that it's probably not pulling much in. The other thing is this is the very beginning of the conversation. If we were further down in the conversation, so like down here in the conversation, if we were then going to follow up with a chat message, it has all of this information that's come before the chat message to rely on. So that has become part of the context. So you can look at all of these points that it's pulled out, all of this stuff that's come in the prior bit before it in the conversation is now going to be part of what comes next here. So if we've had it pull out of a document, get it into the chat and into the conversation history, and then we put in a simple message, that's a different story because it's taken into account what came before. In contrast, this is at the very beginning of the conversation. Simple message expanding into a lot of content. So when you're going through, watch for these places where you're asking something simple and there's not a lot of context, there's a lot of information, and then you're getting a lot out. Now, what's the classic example for that? You go into ChatGPT and you decide to ask it some factual question as if it's an internet search engine. This is a classic mistake where you're going to potentially see errors. You go and ask it a question and expect it to pull in real documents, real data. It expands your question into some answer that looks extremely convincing, but you've gone from a very small sort of equivalent of an internet search into what looks like search results for an internet search, and in reality what you've gotten is a lot of new information generated that may or may not be correct. In contrast, you give it a document with a prompt and it goes from a lot of information in a document and a prompt down to a smaller information, much less likely to end up in some problematic place.